Here are 5 brutally honest pieces of advice for high schoolers who want to get a 1500 or above on their digital SAT. So the first piece of advice is to realize that actually getting a 1500 or above is very rare. It seems like nowadays people have this idea that if you don't get a 1500 or above, then you didn't get a good SAT in the first place. But the truth is that a 1500 or above is already a top 2% score. Now, to put that in perspective, every year about 2 million, a little bit less, but about 2 million students in America take the SAT. And so to beat 98% of them and be in the top 2% to get a 1500, that means you have to beat 1.96 million of the 2 million. And so when you put it in that kind of frame, you realize that it's not just like getting a good score, it's getting an amazing score, because a 1500 or above is a top 2% score. And so I've talked before about how getting a 1500 or above isn't hard, but the truth is that it's actually very rare. And so going into the SAT thinking that you're just going to get a 1500 or above because you're naturally smart or naturally gifted, or because you studied for like a month or two, that's not a good way to go into it. And you need to have an actual firm grasp on the reality of the situation, which is that you need to beat 98% of other students taking the test to get a 1500 or above. I had a student actually recently who was upset because she got a 1460. A 1460 is still an amazing score. Like, to put it in perspective, a 1460 is still within the normal range for a person who gets admitted into Harvard. But because this student had a skewed perception that anything under a 1500 wasn't good, she was actually disappointed by a Harvard-worthy score. And I think it's really important to just kind of ground yourself in the reality that a 1500 or above, while it may be simple to get there, it's not easy to get there, and it certainly isn't common to get there. And that's kind of a side tangent, is that if it's uncommon to get above a 1500, that probably means that you have to do some uncommon things to get there. And so if you look around and everyone is studying the same way, or everyone is just not studying and that's kind of the normal thing to do, you need to ask yourself, do I want to be like these people? Because these people are taking the normal approach, but they're getting the normal scores. They're not getting the top 1 or 2% scores. But that's kind of a side tangent. So just to bring it back to the rarity of getting a 1500 or above, another example is that in my family, I have 2 older siblings, and both of them got a 1480 on their SAT. And so when I took the SAT, my first score was a 1460. And so even though a 1460 is a very good score, to me it felt like a failure, because the people around me and the people in my family who had already taken the SAT did 20 points better than me. So even though statistically I got a good score, it felt like a failure to me. And so that's why I think it's important to always keep yourself grounded in the actual facts, and to remember that a 1500 or above is not the cutoff for a good score. A good score can look different for many different people, and a 1500 is going to be not just a good score, but an amazing, outstanding score. Because think of it like this: if you took 100 random high school students who just took the SAT and put 100 of them in a room, only 1 or 2 of them would have gotten a 1500 or above. And so say that you go to a school that has 2,000 students. That was about the size of my high school. That means that only about 20 to 40 students in your entire high school will ever get a 1500 or above. And if you're looking at just your class, it's going to be a quarter of that, so 5 to 10 students. And so this isn't to say that you shouldn't shoot for 1500 or above. I think it's good to have high goals and to actually work hard to try to achieve those goals. But this is just kind of to bring you back down to earth a little bit and realize that this is actually a very lofty goal that you're going for, and it's going to be hard, and it's going to take some unusual approaches to actually get there. Piece of advice number 2: big score improvements take time. Now I know this because in my case, like I said, my first score was a 1460, my final score was a 1570, but in between those 2 tests, there was actually like about 6 months of hard grinding and studying. And while I didn't use the typical approach of using a bunch of SAT prep books or anything, I was still studying for those 6 months in between. And it would have been unreasonable for me to have assumed that I could have taken a test 2 weeks after my first score and then improved by the amount that I did. So if you look at some different studies on SAT score improvements, the general consensus is that if you were to study for an hour a day, then it would take about a month to go up 100 points. And so that means if your goal is to get a 1500, then if right now, say you're sitting at a 1300, it's going to take 2 months of studying. And if right now you're sitting at a 1200, it would take about 3 months of studying to get to your goal of a 1500. But even then, that requires those hours of studying to be hard, locked in studying, where you're doing nothing except studying with the one goal of improving your SAT score. And so more realistically, if you're a person who takes a little bit longer to hold on to information, or you can't seem to sit still for an hour and actually lock in and study, then it's probably going to to be about double or triple that amount of time for you. And so when I have students come up and ask me, hey, I have 2 weeks until my SAT, can I go up 200 points from my last score? It's like, well, no, probably not, because that's not enough time for your brain to actually like absorb, and not only absorb, but retain all of the information that you need for that 200 point knowledge gap between your first score and the new score that you want. Advice number 3, you are the only person who decides how well you do. I'm going to go over the 3 most common excuses and why they're all wrong. So first off, it's up to my teachers. They just didn't teach me how to do well on the SAT. Well, the SAT is meant to be separate from the regular curriculum you go through in high school. So it's actually not up to your teachers to have you do well on the SAT, because they're meant to teach you the subjects that they're meant to teach you. There's no class on the SAT in a regular like public high school. That has to be something that you go out and do on your own. Secondly, oh, it's my parents' fault because they can't afford for me to go to this expensive SAT prep where everyone else is going, and that's why they're getting 1500s. So I can't get a 1500 because we can't afford it. Unless your parents are literally holding you in the basement and locking you in there for all of the hours of the day except for when you're at school, then your parents are also not an excuse because of how many free resources there are for the SAT. I mean, not only my free community, but if you just wanted to go to Khan Academy or something like that, there's tons of free resources out there for you to learn about the SAT and to do SAT prep without having to go to your parents for money. And also, it's important to note that any of the people who you might put the burden on for your SAT score, they're not going to be in the testing room when you are sitting there taking the SAT. The only person that's going to be in that room is you. And so it's 100% up to you for how well you do on the SAT. Now, a final excuse you might have is that, oh, it wasn't up to me how smart I am. Maybe I'm just naturally less intelligent, or I have a lower IQ than average, so I just can't do well on the SAT no matter how much I tried. If you were taking the SAT 50 or 60, 70 years ago, then this would be true, because back then SAT prep didn't really exist. And so the SAT correlated better with the IQ test, and so it was more just up to your natural intelligence than anything else. But anyone, no matter how stupid you might think you are or how stupid you actually are, can just memorize the things that you need to memorize for a test. So even if your brain doesn't naturally pick up on things very quickly, and so you normally wouldn't have done well on the SAT, now we have the added luxury that almost everyone does SAT prep, and there's tons of free resources out there. So you can just basically treat your brain like as if you're just a monkey who's memorizing facts, and anyone can improve their SAT score no matter how slow you learn. If you still put in the time that your brain needs, then any human being can realistically do well on the SAT given enough time. Number 4, consistency will beat intensity every single time. So there's kind of 4 different tiers to the consistency intensity dynamic. At the very bottom is if you're inconsistent and you're not intense with your studying. The second tier is when you're inconsistent but you're super intense in the times where you are studying. Then above this is if you're consistent but not intense, and I'm going to go over in a minute exactly why this is ranked higher than intense but inconsistent. But for now, just know that intensity is lower than consistency in terms of how important it is for your studying and your retention of new knowledge. And then finally at the top, you're going to have a consistent routine, but also with a high level of intensity during your studying. And so obviously it's best to be at this top level where you're consistently studying hard, but for most people, they're not going to be able to have that much time and effort to sacrifice to this one thing. So it's going to be one of those lower 2 or 3 tiers where it's going to be either consistency without intensity or intensity without consistency. And so to understand why consistency is more important, a good place to look is the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, which basically says that every 7 days, you're going to forget 90% of whatever you learned on the first day. And so if you're starting at, say, this is day 0, you learn this much knowledge. By day 7, it's actually going to curve down to where you only retain about 10% of the knowledge. And so you're missing this entire 90% that you learned. And so that's why consistency is so important, is because say that you start up here, this is day 0, you start to slip down the curve, but then the next day you decide to be consistent and study again, you're going to jump up to higher than you were on day 1. And then you're going to slide down again. Next day, you're going to jump up even higher. And so the actual trend for you, if we shift everything down, you're going to start here and you're actually going to go up. It's going to be a slow rise and it's going to be linear because you're only studying a little bit each day, but that's going to be much better than the guy who starts up here, waits a week, week, loses 90% of what he studies, and then over here decides to go back up. Sure, he might be 10% higher, but that's going to be 10% every 7 days as opposed to 10% every single day. And so you can see how over a long period of time, that's really going to add up. And so you can see with this curve how if you are an inconsistent studier, then studying more is just going to lead to forgetting more. Because let's just say, to break it down into the most simple terms possible, you're just memorizing vocab terms or something. Say that you learn 100 vocab terms and then you're inconsistent with your studying. After 7 days or after a week, you're going to forget 90 of those 100 words. Now let's say that you were inconsistent but very intense, and instead you would learn 200 words. All that means is that you're going to now forget 180 of the words. And so you think you studied more, but in reality, all you're doing is just forgetting more. And so I need you to think of studying not as just, once I learn this stuff, I've learned it and I'm good, but instead think of it as a constant battle every single day against this curve of forgetting that basically says that every day you're going to forget 10 to 20% of what you learned. And finally, advice number 5, even if you're typically a low GPA student or someone who thinks that they're bad at taking tests, you can still get a very good SAT. A good example of this is a friend who I had senior year of high school who had a 2.6 GPA and still got a 1550 on the SAT. And the crazy part is that with a 2.6 GPA, he still got into UT Austin, which, by the way, if you're not an auto admit to UT Austin, last year it was about a 10% acceptance rate. So getting close to some of the top 20 schools acceptance rate. And he still got into that school with a 2.6 GPA because he had such a good SAT score. And he did also have some very good other extracurriculars, but I would argue that his SAT had a big part in showing that his GPA wasn't really a good indicator of how smart he was. He just didn't care much about the classes that he took, and he had a very specific subset of topics that he was very good at. And so the college was able to recognize that through his very good SAT score, even though he had that 2.6 GPA. And so even if you're someone who thinks that you just can't do well on tests, or you have a low GPA, or you've always done poorly in the past, so you think you just have no shot at getting a good SAT, like I said earlier, you're still a human being with a human brain. And I mean, if you can even understand that I'm speaking English right now, that already shows that you can learn things. I mean, you went from being a baby who was just blabbering to understanding an incredibly complex and nuanced language like how I'm speaking right now. And so you can still learn things, it just might take some more time. So don't think that just because you have a low GPA or you typically get low grades that you're just automatically off the table the possibility of getting a 1500 or above. The road to getting a 1500 is open to everyone, and it's a simple path, but it's a difficult path.